All right, so get this. We're going deep today, like deep into Day of the Tentacle.
Oh, man. Day of the Tentacle.
Right. You know that classic adventure game
Eating
of
apple
Who
tentacles.
Wants to Rule the World?
Totally.
Well, today we're going way beyond the pixels. You know what I mean?
Beyond the pixels. I like it.
We're going to figure out why it became such a legend, like a gaming legend.
Yeah, yeah. What made this game tick?
It's like, think of it like a time machine.
A time machine. Okay. I'm with you.
But instead of going to the past, we're going behind the scenes, right?
Behind the curtain.
Behind the scenes, exactly.
Okay, I'm strapped in. Let's do this.
Okay, so to get there, we've got interviews with the developers, the minds behind it all.
Oh, wow. The masterminds.
Like Tim Schafer, Dave Grossman, those guys.
The legends themselves.
And we're digging into the art, the music, even some.
Somewhat.
Don't leave me hanging.
Let's just say creative interpretations of history.
Ooh, okay, now you've got me intrigued. Day of the Tentacle wasn't just a point and click, right?
You're telling me it was a moment.
A moment, yeah. It changed how games were made.
It was right when everything was changing, CD-ROMs were the new thing,
Sure.
total future. So suddenly you could do all this new stuff with graphics and sound.
And voices.
Oh, yeah, voice acting. Don't forget the voices.
The voices, yeah. Talk about progress.
Game changers.
Game changer, exactly. But okay, let's start at the beginning. Where'd this crazy adventure even come from?
Well, it all started with, believe it or not, a sequel idea.
A sequel?
To what?
To get this, Maniac Mansion? You know, that game, that kind of...
Invented point and click?
Exactly. It was Ron Gilbert, the creator of Maniac Mansion.
Monkey Island, too, right?
Oh, yeah, Monkey Island, too.
Genius.
Total genius.
Yeah.
So anyway, Gilbert, he had this idea for a sequel, but then here's the twist.
Oh, there's a twist. I love twists.
He hands the whole project over.
He hands it over.
To who?
To these two guys, Schafer and Grossman.
Wait, Schafer and Grossman? Like the Schafer and Grossman?
The one and only. And you want to know the best part?
Lay it on me.
They were basically rookies. This was their first time leading a team.
Talk about pressure. First time leading a team, and they make Day of the Tentacle.
Oh.
Wow.
It's wild, right? But they totally nailed it.
They were not afraid to take risks. The whole game's like one big Looney Tunes cartoon.
Oh, 100%. Those wacky characters, the crazy animation.
It's like a cartoon came to life.
It really is. But it's deeper than that, you know?
Deeper. Go on.
That cartoony style, it's in everything. The characters, the sets, the whole feel of the game.
Like those crazy set pieces, right?
Yeah.
Oh, man. You remember that scene?
Which one? There are so many.
When the kids, they get combined into, what was it, the Hogvernard?
Oh, the Hogvernard. Classic, pure cartoon chaos. You can totally see the Chuck Jones influence,
Chuck.
Yeah. From Looney Tunes. Like, the lead animator on Day of the Tentacle, Larry Ahern, he was a huge fan, took a lot of inspiration from Jones, pushed the animation even further than Monkey Island.
The Monkey Island, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, but so we have to talk about the voices.
The voices. Oh, yeah, the voices.
Day of the Tentacle was the first LucasArts game to have, like, full-on voice acting.
That's right. They called them talkies back then. It was all thanks to CD-ROMs,
The power of CD-ROM.
Exactly.
I mean, I can't even imagine the game without those voices.
Right. Huggy, Laverne, the Tentacles.
It's like they were born to play those roles.
Seriously. But here's a fun fact for you. Full voice acting, it wasn't even part of the original plan.
Whoa, seriously, what happened?
So they were thinking floppy disks, right? That was
Right.
the standard back then. But then games like Myst started blowing up on CD-ROM.
Myst, that atmospheric puzzle game.
That's the one. And it really showed off what CD-ROM could do.
So the Day of the Tentacle team, they had to, like, change everything midway through.
Oh, yeah, big time. They had to figure out how to add voice acting to a game that wasn't designed for it.
Imagine that in the early 90s.
It was a whole different world back then. I mean, no big-name celebrity voice actors like today.
So how did they find people?
Get this. They used The Hollywood Reporter. Can you believe it?
Talk about old school.
Old school for sure. It's amazing they pulled it off. But hey, speaking of crazy, Day of the Tentacle totally messed with American history.
Oh yeah, they took liberties for sure.
It's like they took all those historical myths and legends and just went nuts with them. You remember that whole suggestion box thing for the Constitution?
Oh man, the suggestion box. Pure comedic gold.
Right. It's a running gag throughout the whole game.
So good.
Yeah.
And then there's George Washington chopping down kumquat trees instead of cherry trees.
Kumquat trees. I love it. It's those little twists on history that make the game so memorable. But how much of it is actually true? It's time for some myth busting.
Okay, give me with the facts. Let's start with Thomas Jefferson. He's in the game, right? Hanging out with the Founding Fathers at the Constitutional Convention.
Ah, nope. Jefferson was actually in France at the time. He was the American minister there. So, yeah, big historical oopsie.
Wow, okay. Well, at least they got George Washington right. I mean, everyone knows about those iconic wooden teeth.
Another myth. Washington did have benchers, but they weren't made of wood. They were actually crafted from ivory, gold, and even lead.
Lead, ew. Talk about a metallic taste in your mouth. Okay, how about Ben Franklin? Surely they didn't mess up the kite experiment too badly, did they?
Well, they got his eccentric personality down pat, but the portrayal of his famous kite experiment is way off. In the game, he's flying the kite on a perfectly clear sunny day, which isn't exactly ideal for attracting lightning.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty crucial detail to miss. But Franklin's experiment did prove that lightning was electrical, right?
Absolutely, and that's why it's so important that the real Franklin took safety precautions during his experiment. He understood the dangers of electricity and made sure to ground himself properly. In the game, he basically runs inside at the first sign of rain, complaining about the cold.
Huh. So they turned a pivotal moment in scientific history into a slackstick comedy routine. Classic Day of the Tentacle. But wait a minute, something's not adding up here. If Hoagie is 200 years in the past from 1993, wouldn't that place him in 1793?
Sharp observation, you're absolutely right. And guess what? Franklin actually died in 1790. So yeah, his appearance in the game is chronologically impossible.
Another historical blooper. But wait a minute. Wasn't Day of the Tentacle a sequel to Maniac Mansion, which came out in 1987?
Good catch. You're right, Maniac Mansion was released in 1987. If we assume the present in Day of the Tentacle actually refers to 1987, then that would place Hoagie in 1787, which at least falls within Franklin's lifetime. But even then, there's another problem. Franklin conducted his experiments in Philadelphia, while the game never explicitly states the location of the Edison mansion.
So even if they got the year right, the location is still wrong. It seems like the developers were more interested in using history as a comedic playground than sticking to the facts. But let's not forget about John Hancock, the guy with the famously large signature. Surely they got something right about him, right?
Well, the game definitely plays up the whole signature thing, portraying him as this flamboyant guy who uses it to impress women. However, Hancock should have been married at the time of the Constitutional Convention.
Ah, so much for historical accuracy. It's like every historical figure gets the Day of the Tentacle treatment, exaggerated personalities, wacky scenarios, and a complete disregard for the facts.
Exactly. The game never pretends to be a history lesson. It's a comedic adventure that uses historical figures and events as a backdrop for its wacky shenanigans.
And it works so well. Think about all those anachronisms sprinkled throughout the game, like Hoagie using a can opener in the 18th century. Priceless.
And don't forget about those ridiculous amendments to the Constitution, like the one guaranteeing every American a vacuum cleaner in their basement. It's pure satire, and it adds to the overall absurdity of the game.
Okay, so we've established that Day of the Tentacle isn't exactly a reliable source of historical information. But does it really matter? I mean, does the game's historical inaccuracy actually detract from its overall impact?
That's a great question, and I think it depends on your perspective. Some people might argue that it's disrespectful to play fast and loose with history, especially when it comes to such important figures and events.
Yeah, I can see that point of view. These are real people who shaped the course of history, after all.
But on the other hand, you could argue that the game actually sparks an interest in history, encouraging players to dig deeper and learn more about the real people and events behind those caricatures.
It's like instead of reading a dry textbook, you're experiencing history through time-traveling tentacles and exploding cigars.
Exactly. And let's be honest, the game's humor wouldn't be nearly as effective if it were completely accurate. It's that absurdity, the unexpected twists on familiar figures and events that make Day of the Tentacle so memorable.
Right. It's not exactly a documentary.
Mm-hmm.
But even if the historical details are fuzzy, the game still manages to capture the spirit of those times in a way. The costumes, the architecture, even the language. It all contributes to the sense of historical authenticity, albeit a very twisted one.
Absolutely. And remember, the game was released in 1993, a time when there was a lot of nostalgia for the 1950s and early 1960s. Maybe the developers were tapping into that same sense of nostalgia, but with a more satirical edge.
That's an interesting thought. So even if the historical details aren't completely accurate, the game still evokes this certain feeling, this atmosphere that resonates with players. But there's one more thing I have to ask about. The character of Betsy Ross. The game portrays her as this legendary seamstress who sewed the first American flag. But isn't that story just a myth?
Oh, you're spot on to question that one. The Betsy Ross story, it's like been debated forever.
Yeah.
No one really knows for sure if she actually made the first American flag, but,
It's a good story.
it's a great story. It's become this, legend, you know,
Part of history.
part of how we think about history, even if it didn't really happen that way.
It's like the George Washington cherry tree thing.
Exactly.
Fun story, probably never happened.
But it's part of our collective memory, And Day of the Tentacle, I think it's playing with that.
It's like they're saying, hey, remember all that stuff you learned in school? What if we, mixed it all up?
Threw it in a blender.
Threw it in a blender, yeah.
Yeah.
Added some time travel, some talking tentacles.
Dash of absurdity.
Absurdity, yeah.
And what do you get? This hilarious game that also makes you think,
It makes you think, yeah. Like, what do we really know about history? And how did they even become stories in the first place?
It's pretty cool.
It is cool. So, okay, let's zoom out for a sec. Day of the Tentacle, it's this amazing adventure game.
It really is.
Unique art style, awesome music.
And the writing.
Yeah.
Still so funny.
Hilarious.
Yeah.
And, okay, maybe they played fast and loose with history.
Just a little bit.
But it's entertaining. And you know what? Maybe even a little educational, too.
I think so. I mean, it's not a textbook, but
it makes you curious.
It does. Maybe it'll even inspire people to, actually go and learn about the real history.
Right. Like all those crazy antics in the game, maybe they'll make someone want to pick up a history book and be like, okay, what really happened?
Exactly.
It's like a gateway to real history.
I love that. A gateway.
So before we go, I got to ask, the big question. We've talked about the tech, the humor, the unique take on history.
It's special.
Special, yeah. But what about its legacy? What can Day of the Tentacle teach us about making games that people will remember, Even today, with all the fancy graphics and complex stories and stuff.
That's the question, isn't it? What makes a game truly great? And I think Day of the Tentacle shows us that you don't need all the bells and whistles.
You don't.
Sometimes all you need is some creativity, some good humor, and maybe, just maybe, a tentacle or two.
A tentacle or two, yeah. Well, on that note, we're going to wrap things up for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Day of the Tentacle. Until next time.
See ya.